On Monday, October 19th, Albertans will head to the polls in a provincial referendum. The 10th and final question on the ballot reads, should Alberta remain a province of Canada, or should the government of Alberta commence the legal process required under the Canadian Constitution to hold a binding referendum on whether or not to separate from Canada? How did we get here, and where could this lead? These are some of the questions explored in a new book. Tyler Dawson is a former Alberta correspondent for the National Post and currently an opinion editor for the Globe and Mail. He is also the editor of the Republic of Alberta, an idea that won't go away, and he joins me now. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Usually my first question is some variation of what made you write the book or why now, but the answers to both of those seem kind of obvious. So instead, I'll ask you something like, what were you hoping to learn by writing this book?
Well, I think it wasn't so much what I wanted to learn, but what I hoped that readers would take away from it. And, I think journalists have talked a lot over the past 10 years about sort of the role they play in moderating discussions between different factions in society. When Donald Trump was elected for the first time, there was a lot of surprise among journalists that he had won the presidential election. And part of the reason why people were so surprised is they hadn't been talking to the right people and they hadn't really understood the different sort of segments of society. And so I think I took that to heart, and I think a lot of other reporters took that to heart as well. And so part of what I wanted to achieve, the main thing I think I wanted to achieve, was to try and write a book where both sides of the argument, so to speak, could come away with a better understanding of their sort of political opponents and a better understanding of why we're in the position that we are now. This was something that I've been covering, on and off for the better part of the last decade. And so this was sort of an opportunity, I felt, to give it a long form, serious treatment and hopefully help people on all sides of the issue understand each other a little bit better.
Now, as you point out in the book, Alberta separatism, much like Western alienation, is not a new idea, but
Mhm.
as you explained, the re-election of the Liberals last year, this time under Mark Carney, seems to have given the movement new life. Why is that?
Well, it has sort of been growing for the better part of the past decade. There was a lot of anger in Alberta directed towards the federal government and the feeling that the federal government was treating Alberta poorly. And so it actually really reached what I think was the peak in about 2018, 2019. If you look at some of the polling back then, there's some really remarkable numbers. Environics did polling that found in 2019, 71% of Albertans felt that their province was disrespected by the rest of the country. That's like an astonishingly large number. And it's actually come down, the people that feel that way. It's come down to closer to 50, 55% of Albertans feel that way. So in a weird way, people are actually less angry than they were 7, 8 years ago, which is a really weird sort of state of affairs. Why is it that people are talking so much about separatism now when this anger seems to have less sort of breadth? But I think that people in Alberta who'd felt sort of oppressed by Ottawa for so long had really banked a lot on Pierre Poilievre winning the 2025 federal election. They felt that a lot of their problems were going to go away because there was going to be a new prime minister, a conservative prime minister who would perhaps treat the province a little bit differently, perhaps a little bit better in their eyes. And so when that didn't happen, when sort of once again Central Canada, Eastern Canada, and the BC coast elected the Liberals, they felt that, they tried and hoped for this political change in Ottawa, and that didn't happen. And so this nuclear option of separation sort of came roaring back, came back into vogue.
It seems like these feelings have always been bubbling underneath the surface. And as you are a journalist, a lot of places in the book, you're more of a historian, pointing out that Albertans have always felt hard done by right back to the beginning when they became a province in 1905, even before the beginning. What are some of those historical bones of contention in your view?
Yeah, it's funny. I did play historian a bit, and it got me back to my roots. I mean, I did a history and political science degree for my undergraduate education, so it was fun to do a little bit of the history thing again. Um, the big one, sort of one of the original sins, I guess you could say, was in 1905 when Alberta became a province, and Saskatchewan as well. Those provinces did not get control over their natural resources. Those powers sort of remained with the federal government in Ottawa. And this sort of remained the case until 1930, when there was a transfer of that power sort of over to the provinces, and Alberta and Saskatchewan gained the full powers that the other provinces had had. And this sort of sense that Alberta did not have control over a portion of its destiny actually predates Alberta joining Confederation as well. If you look at newspaper columns, for example, from the late 20th or late 19th century, I should say, that sentiment is really, really present. And so that sort of like, and those are the same sort of issues in many ways that we're talking about now, right? Is control over natural resources, the power to sort of control your own destiny without Ottawa sort of dictating some of these things. And there are examples way back in the beginning of that, the national policy under John A. Macdonald, which sort of forced east-west trade as opposed to maybe more natural north-south trade in the prairies. But this sort of original sin, I guess you could call it, sort of persists for a long time. And there is a little bit of separatist sentiment that comes up in the early 20th century, very, very minor. A little bit of separatist sentiment that comes up in the 1930s, again, fairly minor, but in the context of Alberta trying to do something and Ottawa not allowing it. In the case of the 1930s, it was banking regulations. But it really isn't until the 1980s when you have the National Energy Program that really sort of the dynamic changes, sort of permanently alters, I think, the political relationship between Alberta and Ottawa.
Now, there is the long-held perception that Alberta puts far more into Canada than it gets out of the country, namely in the form of the equalization program. It seems like they have a legitimate beef in terms of the money that goes out and the money that comes back in.
Yeah, this is a really long-running sort of bone of contention. I think there was one year, 1955, 56, or 57, 58, one of the two, where Alberta actually did get equalization payments. But other than that, it's been a net contributor to the equalization program. It's a complicated thing because the equalization program is one of those things that pretty much everybody thinks it needs to be reformed somehow. And it was modified a little bit when Stephen Harper was prime minister. But there doesn't seem to be much political will to change it currently. But it is sort of this long-running bone of contention, and you see that in sort of in conservative spaces in addition to separatist spaces. But it is sort of this general overall sense, right, that Alberta has contributed so much to Canada and is getting so little in return. And actually, ironically, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Alberta actually got more money from the federal government than it paid in for one of the first times in decades. But this is a really long-running grievance, and it is a motivator for a lot of people on the political right in Alberta, both separatists and non-separatists. So it's an issue that also doesn't seem to go away, and it's the sort of thing that keeps people in Alberta voting for conservative parties rather than, for example, the Liberal Party, as well as influencing some of the separatist sentiment.
Now, there are many players that you mention in the book. Chief among them, for the purposes of the referendum, is Premier Danielle Smith. Some have taken to look at her as a David Cameron-like figure by courting sovereigntists in her own party and putting this to a referendum question. And then there's the Prime Minister who's taken to likening this referendum to Brexit, being that it's happening about 10 years after that, and we're starting to see the effects of Brexit. Is there a chance, in my long-winded way of asking this question, is there a chance this could all blow up in Danielle Smith's face?
There is a way it could blow up in her face. I don't think there's a way it blows up in her face that leads to Alberta separating. What I mean by that is this. The separatist sentiment has peaked around 30% support in Alberta. And it does actually, some pollsters have found that it's actually declined by about 10 percentage points in the last few months. So, basically once things got more serious, people started saying, I'm actually not in favor of this. I might be in favor of this to send a message, but gosh, now that it's happening, this maybe isn't what I want. So I don't think the have a referendum side of this sort of weird referendum question in October, I don't think that side wins. The way that it blows up potentially for Danielle Smith has to do with internal party dynamics. Probably a slim majority of membership in the United Conservative Party in Alberta are separatists, to varying degrees. Maybe not super hardcore separatists, but probably, casually in favor of this. They do actually generally seem to be happy with the way Danielle Smith is handling this file. There's polling from Ipsos earlier this month, I think June 5th or something like that basically said 79% of separatists in Alberta are happy with the way she's handling this. So that suggests she might not see a revolt within her own party if most of these people are in fact happy. But there is still the possibility, there's still 20% of separatists who are angry. That probably means, there's 20% of the separatists within her own party who are angry with this, and they could organize in a fashion that causes her problems. They could call for an early leadership review. They could try and get her removed as leader and replaced with someone who's more seriously pro-separatism. So I think the way that blows up for her maybe is managing these internal party dynamics rather than the broader question of separation in Alberta politics. And the other way that it could blow up in her face, of course, is there's an election in Alberta next year. And she's going to have to defend her decisions on this file to, the entire Alberta population, not just the people within her party, not just the separatists, but, the sort of 70-ish% of Albertans who want sort of nothing to do with this question. So it could be a real albatross for her come next year.
It certainly explains the sense of urgency she has with the memorandum of understanding and getting another bitumen pipeline to the west coast of BC. And as you point out in the book, that's not good enough for some factions of the separatist movement to make Alberta to make Confederation work better for Alberta.
Yeah, if you look at the lesson that the Premier and I think to some extent Prime Minister Mark Carney have drawn is looking at the National Energy Program in the 1980s. When the NEP came into effect in 1980, it led to this pretty significant upswing in anger in Alberta, and in addition, the creation of two sort of significant separatist movements. And that sentiment sort of persists for 4 or 5 years, but it actually goes away. And it goes away when the NEP is repealed, and it goes away when Brian Mulroney is elected prime minister. And the lesson that politicians have drawn from that is, if some of the things that have made Albertans mad in the past are addressed, this sentiment will go away. And that includes, a new pipeline to the West Coast. That includes what Danielle Smith calls the 9 bad laws that she's been talking about for the past year. She thinks that if those things are addressed, the sentiment's going to go away. I think that's partially true. I think there's probably a lot of these frustrated Federalists who might vote for separation to send a message to Ottawa. They might be mollified by some of these policy changes. The real hardcore sort of 10-15% of separatists, I don't think their concerns are going to be addressed by these. I think they are going to persist as a force in Alberta politics beyond this referendum, whatever the outcome may be.
Now, you draw some parallels between Quebec and Alberta, as Quebec has twice asked voters about separation through a referendum. What are the similarities and the differences here? And is the Clarity Act helpful at all in the Alberta experience?
I would say there are more differences than similarities at the end of the day. Quebec is a really clear-cut example of sort of a subnational group that is agitating for sort of a right to self-determination. And, it has a distinct language. It has a distinct culture. It had for a very long time, less so now, but very much so in the past, a distinct religion from the rest of the country. It has sort of the ingredients that make up a unique cultural group within Canada. It's a little bit harder to argue that Alberta has those things. Is a person in Grand Prairie that different from a person in Fort St. John, for example, or in rural Saskatchewan for that matter? It's hard to make the case that Alberta is a culturally distinct group seeking self-determination. The grievances in Alberta are primarily economic and to some extent political as well, and a lot less, I think, on the cultural front. So that's a really significant difference between Alberta and Quebec. There are some sort of long-running similarities in terms of the political grievances that both provinces have. Quebec always insisting on more provincial control over matters rather than delegating some of those powers to the federal government. Immigration is a key example. Alberta is pushing for some of those powers to have itself as well. So there's some political similarities in that front. The Clarity Act, it does matter, and it matters because, there's no reason why Alberta needs to follow the Clarity Act in order to secede from Canada. There's sort of this gentleman's agreement that you need to follow the Clarity Act in order to have sort of constitutional secession. That doesn't seem to be the case from what the experts I spoke to said. There are other countries in the world that broke away from sort of parent states without this sort of orderly transition. Alberta could declare independence if it got, recognition from some other international states. That would sort of be good enough in many ways. So the Clarity Act is really important because it does set out the process. If Alberta plays by the rules, if Alberta, heaven forbid, votes to secede, it could follow the Clarity Act process. That is sort of a laid out process by how this would work. It would sort of tamp down some of the, really chaotic circumstances that could arise from that vote. So it exists because it's important because it sets out the process. If Alberta chooses to follow that process, which it does seem like that is the road we're going down, it does sort of ensure that everybody plays by the rules and sort of knows what's going to happen and how it's going to work.
So let's cast our minds then to October 19th when
Mhm.
Alberta cast their referendum ballot. Uh, since it's a question of a question, two ways it could go. What happens?
Well, the first way it could go, the first question is going to be, should Alberta remain in Canada? So that's, pretty straightforward. Yes, Alberta should remain in Canada. No, Alberta should not remain in Canada. The second half is going to be, should Alberta begin the process to hold a referendum on secession, probably under the Clarity Act, is basically what that question's asking. I expect in both those situations, the yes, remain in Canada side will win, and the no, Alberta should not begin this process will win. If for some reason there's a massive upset, then the premier needs to sort of decide whether or not she's going to hold a referendum on seceding under the Clarity Act, when that's going to be held, what that question is actually going to be at the end of the day, because we don't have a proper secession question. The Clarity Act sets out that it must be a clear majority on a clear question, and that the double-barreled referendum that we're having, it does not really satisfy those requirements. And then there is a bunch of involvement for the federal government after that point. The House of Commons, for example, will determine whether or not that question is clear. So there becomes this major sort of political discussion with other levels of government around the country, should Alberta choose to go down that road. But chances are, this is the sovereigntists lose, and chances are this, to some extent, sort of recedes a little bit as a major feature of Alberta's political landscape. But then the premier, as I mentioned earlier, is going to have to sort of defend her decision making on this for the next year, because there's going to be an election. And I have a very hard time imagining that the Alberta New Democrats are going to let this kind of go away. I think they're going to probably try and campaign very heavily on the idea that Danielle Smith risked breaking up the country for her political career.
What do you hope the reader takes away from the book ultimately?
I think they take away, I think the Federalists, I hope that they take away an understanding of why separatists feel the way they do. There's a part in the book where I spoke to someone from Spruce Grove, which is sort of a bedroom community of Edmonton. And she said, look, I am struggling to get by. I look at my paycheck and I look at my bills and I can't reconcile that math. But I look at how much money I pay in federal taxes. And if I didn't have to do that, my life would be better. I hope they take away the sense that this is not just sort of fringe lunatics and conspiracy theorists, that there are people who really, truly, genuinely believe that their lives, the lives of their people they love, the lives of their neighbors, are going to be better in an independent Alberta. And that's the case I think that the Federalists need to make. So I hope that's the lesson they take away from it. The Separatists, I hope they come away with a better understanding of where they sort of fit in history, and how this movement has evolved over the years and why it exists. That, again, this is not just a reaction to Justin Trudeau, this has, sort of deep roots, and that they fit within this tradition of grievance politics. And I also hope they come away with an understanding of sort of why Alberta has not done this in the past, why Alberta has stayed in Canada, what benefits the province accrues from being in Canada, and things like that.
The name of the book is The Republic of Alberta, an idea that won't go away. It is published by Sutherland House. My thanks to author Tyler Dawson.
Thanks for having me. It was a great time.